Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and I am here today to talk about the Pulitzer Prize, whether or not it's in trouble, and what could potentially be done to fix it. If you know me, you know I am a Pulitzer Prize for fiction fanatic. I have been following the prize closely for about 20 years now, and if you would like more information about my origin story as a Pulitzer fan, I discuss it in my deep dive about Jhumpa Lahiri's Interpreter of Maladies, which will be linked down below, along with a whole host of other videos that I have done about the Pulitzer Prize and the winners. Now, any fan of any annual tradition knows very well that there are ebbs and flows to fandom. There are going to be off years. That's true if you follow the Pulitzer Prizes, the Booker Prizes, the Academy Awards, any sports team, and so on. Honestly, it's part of the joy in the process. It would probably get really boring if it was always good. You just have to remember that there's always next year. That type of thinking has gotten me through a lot of slumps in my fandom, both with the Academy Awards and with the Pulitzer Prizes. But at this point, it feels like a troubling new trend is emerging with the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And as any good fan must do when something they love falters, I find myself asking, is the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in trouble? I'm asking this after several years of predominantly lackluster winners in the fiction category. Because that has been the trend for a decade now, it does not feel like this is a case of just an off year here and there. It is beginning to feel systemic. And it has to be said that the function of the Pulitzer Prize board, specifically its insularity and secretiveness, feels out of date and possibly needs refreshing. I don't necessarily want to besmirch the recent fiction winners, but I do think the quality of the winners has gone down on average over the last decade. Oddly, the 2012 controversy acts as a sort of dividing line for quality control purposes. The Pulitzer Prize for fiction had been on an absolute roll when 2012 happened. The winners from 1999 through 2011 are solid as a rock. I might quibble that I would have given the 1999 prize to Barbara Kingsolver for the Poisonwood Bible, or that I think the 2009 award should have gone to Louise Erdrich for The Plague of Doves. But do you know what books those would be replacing? Michael Cunningham's The Hours and Elizabeth Strout's Olive Kitteridge. Even if you leave things as they are, it's an incredible lineup of books. No duds whatsoever. Things have been different since the Pulitzer had that off year. Some books have largely been forgotten, like The Orphan Master's Son or The Night Watchman, which also feels far too much like a consolation prize for overlooking Louise Erdrich so many times in the past. And if The Night Watchman feels like it has been overlooked, it's really just because there have been so many bangers in Louise Erdrich's past. There are also cilantro books. You either love them or you hate them. There's very little in between, like The Goldfinch or The Overstory. The Sympathizer and Trust are interesting choices, but in my opinion, just okay books. Less, The Netanyahus and Night Watch are cilantro books at best, but I feel confident calling them bad wins, full stop. There are only 4 books that I would say stand up to the quality the Pulitzer has set for itself. All the Light We Cannot See, The Underground Railroad, The Nickel Boys, and Demon Copperhead. And I'm a little iffy on including the Nickel Boys in that group. So if you're keeping score, only 4 out of the last 13 winners are great. 6 of them are okay, depending on your response to them. And 3 feel like the completely wrong choice. That's not a great record. Your mileage will obviously vary. I know many people who finished and liked The Goldfinch and especially The Overstory. I know people who liked The Netanyahus and Night Watch, although I always notice that even positive reviews of Night Watch end up complaining about aspects of the book. I have certainly talked to people who did not like Demon Copperhead nearly as much as I do. Reading is subjective. No one is right and no one is wrong. What makes a book prizeworthy is also subjective. That makes this a really difficult conversation to have. And honestly, that's why it has taken me so long to put these thoughts down and actually start filming this video. If you don't think there's a problem with recent Pulitzer Prize winners, that's fine. However, as someone who frequently discusses the Pulitzer Prize for fiction on the internet, I know that I'm far from being the only person concerned about the state of the prize. I've had a lot of conversations with people who either are not thrilled with recent selections, don't understand how the Pulitzer Prize works, don't think it as much fun as other major book prizes, or some combination of all of those things. So I think this is a conversation that is worth having. I want to say that anytime I discuss the Pulitzer, and especially when I get a little critical of the Pulitzer, I start getting comments that are some variation of, I never take the Pulitzer seriously because it's not a serious prize. Let's not do that. It is a serious prize. You just don't like it. That's fine, but let's not pretend that it isn't a significant award. A lot of people take it seriously. I've met a lot of them as I've traveled along in my project to read all of the fiction winners. This is not an invitation to dunk on the Pulitzer. It's a conversation about whether or not improvements could be made and what those improvements could look like. Having said that, I think the Pulitzer has not adapted all that well to the modern moment. It's having an awkward stage where it wants to stay the same, but the media landscape has altered very rapidly around it. In this video, I will talk about some structural problems and some quality problems that exist with the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. There will be timestamps to both if you would prefer to navigate around. I will also talk about some barriers to fixing those issues and speculate as to how to circumvent those barriers. First, I think it's important to talk about some of the structural problems. So let's do that first. I don't really want to get into the history of the Pulitzer Prizes. If you're interested, I already did a video about its origins. It will be linked in the description box down below. But I do think part of the problem is that the Pulitzer has such a long and occasionally infamous backstory. It's a prize that is over 100 years old. While it has done a lot to adapt to changes in technology, media, and society, such as adding a category for audio reporting, which allows podcasts to be eligible, essentially, there are perhaps inevitably areas where it has growing pains adjusting to modern realities. The Pulitzer Prize for fiction just does not look or function like other major book prizes in 2024. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from, because people expect it to look like what they are familiar with. But that is part of the problem. The Pulitzer Prize isn't just a fiction prize. It's not even primarily a book prize at all. There are 23 categories for the Pulitzer Prizes every year, and only 7 are for books. The rest are for journalism, aside from another arts category dedicated to music. The Pulitzer Prize was created to recognize journalism. Its namesake, Joseph Pulitzer, was a journalist. However, he requested that artistic categories be included in part to show the strength of American art on the world stage. Remember, in the early 1900s, the United States was a fairly new country that Europeans often did not take seriously. It had to fight for legitimacy. Again, we don't need to get into the history here, especially when I've already done that in a different video. That is just to point out that the book awards are only a portion of what the Pulitzer Prizes give out yearly. Arguably, if you start to change how the arts prizes are awarded, it could create conflict with the rest of the categories. Then you end up with a situation like the Academy Awards having an annual standoff with ABC about whether or not to cut smaller, less popular categories like Best Documentary Short from the broadcast. It creates hurt feelings, and it implies that some categories are more important than others. I think that is important to note because none of the potential issues faced by the Pulitzer Board have an easy fix. I want to acknowledge that. However, I think any reasonable person can look at the division in categories and recognize that they are fundamentally awarding different industries when you pivot from journalism to arts. I think it is abundantly clear that the audience for the arts categories is different from the audience for journalism. Journalism is more insular, celebrated by and among people who are journalists. I mean, sure, It also allows bragging rights that might get a newspaper more subscribers, but that's really just an advertising opportunity. The public probably doesn't know who won a Pulitzer for Best Breaking News Reporting last year, or even this year. That's not to diminish the achievement, what it represents, or how vital breaking news reporting is. It's just a fact that the American public doesn't pay close attention. There is, however, evidence that the American public cares a great deal about what books win a Pulitzer, especially in the fiction category. If you don't believe me, look into the controversy that erupted in 2012 when the Pulitzer board failed to choose a winner. If it's helpful, I have a video about that as well. It will also be linked in the description box down below. Chief among the complaints from bookstores across the country was how they had been deprived of the sales increase that usually comes with the prize announcement. And this bears repeating. I've met many people who, like me, read along with the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and spend a lot of time and energy trying to predict what will win. I'm even in a Discord group dedicated to that. It's not that it's impossible that that could exist for the journalism categories, but I do think it would be very niche and unlikely. I don't want to get into the weeds here, so rather than continue to make a case for why there's a fundamental difference between the journalism and arts prizes, I'm going to assume that we agree. If you want to debate that, leave a comment down below. Hi, Editing Greg is jumping in. I'm sitting here with my dog Teddy editing this video. It's just exhausting being as adorable as he is. And of course, this area has terrible lighting, but I wanted to jump in because I did kind of gloss over discussion about the Pulitzer and how it is structurally very different from other book prizes. And because I glossed over it, I don't know that I really hammered in that I really think this is the biggest barrier for change that the Pulitzer Prize faces, because that is a huge deal. And it's not a problem that any other book prize faces. Like, the Booker Prize doesn't have other wings or categories that they have to worry about. The National Book Award has several categories, but they're all dedicated to books. So they don't have to worry about this type of thing. The Pulitzer does, and that is a huge barrier for change. And I do really think it's very different. I do think some of the changes that I am about to discuss could apply to journalism. I don't know to what extent they could apply, because I'm not a journalist. I don't really know how the journalism world works. That's kind of part of the problem for me as an outsider to that industry. So it is very different. I do feel like they could make a lot of these changes that I'm about to talk about, and they would apply to journalism and books. I don't know how useful they would be for the journalism categories, but I just wanted to hop on and really hammer in that this is a huge structural problem that the Pulitzer has that other book prizes don't. And that's a big reason why the Pulitzer looks so different. And the only thing is that it makes it feel less fun to other people, but it is a huge problem that is not an easy fix because the different sides of the Pulitzer are so different. And I hope that makes sense. One last look at Teddy being adorable and napping, and then we'll go back to the rest of the video. Thank you. If we agree, we can talk about how it shouldn't be a problem for the Pulitzer Board to treat the arts categories differently from the rest of the prizes. It would give these categories a platform that they don't currently have. While I don't necessarily think that the Pulitzer Board should be thinking about competing more directly with other book prizes, it wouldn't hurt. They are certainly losing traction to other book prizes that are playing a social media game and platforming themselves. And it's just something to think about. Now, you probably think that I'm about to advocate for the Pulitzer to revamp the format for its artistic categories to mimic the National Book Awards, which is similar to the Booker Prize and many other book prizes, except that, like the Pulitzer, the National Book Awards has multiple categories for books. That would mean that the Pulitzer should release a long list, then a short list, and then finally have a big splashy winner announcement. I'm not actually advocating for that. I like that there's a significant book prize that keeps you guessing until the moment that the award is announced. It makes it exciting. I would not be opposed to the finalists getting announced ahead of time because there is strength in that. It gets audiences invested ahead of time. It allows for greater or at least more prolonged social media impact, which is a big deal nowadays. I would be okay with it if the Pulitzer did make that change, but I don't think it's necessary. Hi, Editing Greg is jumping in again, and Teddy is still being adorable and napping. I wanted to just sort of hammer in something that I didn't really touch on here, which is that I think one benefit to announcing a long list and a short list is that everybody's sort of on the same page. Yes, there will be conversations about what is left off the list and what doesn't make it onto the short list, what doesn't win, and all of that stuff. That's kind of part of the social media engagement that you get when you go through all of those steps in the process. But the danger of just having one big announcement is that when you don't have a long list, when you don't have a short list, people have to speculate and guess. And after last year, when there were so many different contenders for the prize, I'll list them later, people think they know which way the wind is blowing. And when that turns out not to be true, one of two things is going to happen. Either people are going to be pleasantly surprised and shocked, or it's going to feel anticlimactic. And I think based on the reactions that I got on my Pulitzer Prize reaction, on videos that I posted in the weeks after as people began to read Night Watch by Jane Ann Phillips, and as I finally read it and really didn't like it and posted a video about it, a lot of people felt like it was extremely anticlimactic. People had really gotten invested in the idea that Northwoods by Daniel Mason or Tom Lake by Ann Patchett or The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride would win. So everybody was going in the wrong direction. And that's nobody's fault. You know, when you speculate, there's always a chance you're going to be wrong. But it is a bit of a problem that the Pulitzer has by not announcing a long list in advance. I still like the surprise. And I had hoped that when I read Night Watch by Jane Ann Phillips, it would be that sense of discovery that would be delightful. And it just ultimately wasn't. So I feel like I'm still okay with a surprise, but I do feel like people are so used to a long list and a short list that you avoid that sense of anticlimactic disappointment when everybody ends up being wrong about which way things are going. So back to the rest of the video. I am thinking more specifically about removing the arts categories from the shadows. The Pulitzer is very insular and secretive as an institution. Not only do you not know the finalists before the announcement, you also don't know who the jury is until the announcement is made. Ostensibly, this is to keep the process honest. It prevents people or publishers from campaigning with the jury members. I think there are two problems here. The first and most damning evidence that this probably is not a necessary precaution is the existence of all those other book prizes that announce the jury members months in advance. The Booker Prize, the Women's Prize, the National Book Awards, the International Booker Prize, etc. They all announce their juries in advance, and so far, not one of them has been accused of shenanigans. There's just too much evidence that what they are concerned about is not actually a problem. The second thing is that if someone wants to believe that the jury wasn't influenced by an author or publisher, keeping their identity secret will not actually make anyone feel better. When Hernan Diaz tied with Barbara Kingsolver for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction a year ago, a segment of people believed that he probably had an in with the Pulitzer board since he works at Columbia University, which administers the prizes. They didn't dodge any conspiracy theories by keeping the jury a secret. Furthermore, are we really to believe that authors, critics, or whoever else makes it onto the jury has no connection to the authors whose work they are considering? Of course they do. Many writers who have been through MFA programs have even been mentored by notable authors. Paul Harding found out that he won a Pulitzer Prize for Tinkers in his office at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and he immediately ran to the office of Marilynne Robinson, another Pulitzer Prize winner, who had been his teacher. That's just an example of authors having connections with each other. Marilynne Robinson had nothing to do with Harding's win, although she had been a champion of his work. It's just to show that authors are connected. They know each other. They go to events together. They teach together. Keeping the identity of the jury secret doesn't get around that. and it won't convince anyone who believes that the jury is playing favorites. You know what would actually help show that the jury offered up books that they are genuinely passionate about? Getting them out there to talk about the finalists, allowing them to do interviews about their process and how they settled on these books. Hindering them with an NDA so they can never speak publicly about their task does the opposite. It makes it feel like they have something to hide. The Pulitzer jury is filled with notable literary figures every year, but we don't get to hear from them beyond seeing the books that they recommended as finalists. The only recent occasion we got to hear about the process a jury went through was that controversial year of 2012, when Michael Cunningham went on the record on behalf of the jury to show that they had done what was expected of them. But that only happened because there had been a breach of contract when the board failed to name a winner. Allowing the jury to speak about the finalists would generate excitement about the books, and it could be good publicity for the Pulitzer Prize itself. After this year's announcement, one of my big questions was how the jury settled on those 3 finalists, given all the excellent literature from last year they had to choose from. I wouldn't have to wonder that if the jury could talk about it. I might still disagree with their conclusion, but wouldn't it be nice to hear from them about those books, why they liked them, and why they think they are important or worth recognizing? And it would be nice to hear from the board itself, since the board has such an essential role in the process. How did we get a tie last year? What made Night Watch stand out from the other finalists this year? Viet Thanh Nguyen and David Remnick are on the board, so I can only assume they have input on the fiction winner. And it's not like we don't have board members who can give good interviews. The silence and the secrecy are deafening. And I know why the Pulitzer Board is so concerned with secrecy. In the past, there have been very public disagreements between the juries and the board, between jury members and among the board itself. It doesn't always make the Pulitzer as an institution look good when we know that the board refused to give a prize at all rather than see it go to Gravity's Rainbow, which they called obscene. Or that the president of Columbia University, who was a board member, staged a coup to deny Ernest Hemingway recognition for Whom the Bell Tolls. Or when jury members and board members quit from their positions in protest when they don't agree with the selection or feel indignant that a book they like was passed over. All of these things and more have happened, making the Pulitzer as an organization look bad. I don't think the solution is to shroud the organization in secrecy, binding everyone involved in the process with an NDA so the dirt won't be revealed. As an aside, I don't know that NDAs or non-disclosure agreements are involved, but it seems like it would make sense for them to be because there is so much silence about the process and what goes on behind the scenes, and that's so different from the way it used to be. I have to believe that it's possible to run an organization without such flagrant misbehavior, but I do think that is how we arrived at this point where everything is so secret. It's just, that's not the way things need to be. And it has to be said, we live in an age of social media. The Pulitzer is losing on engagement compared to other major prizes. It's nice that they released a podcast offering a closer look at last year's winners, but that's not the same thing. The Pulitzer feels unwilling to accept social media, preferring more old school methods of reaching an audience. And maybe that's because it is primarily a journalistic enterprise. Mainstream or legacy media is still struggling to find a foothold. It's trying to entrench itself in where it was so it will stay relevant. And maybe the Pulitzer is stuck in the same feedback loop. It's just going over and over and over again and again and again. But relying on old school methods of reaching an audience makes it feel more formal and unapproachable. I'm not suggesting that the Pulitzer should partner with influencers or start posting memes on their Instagram account. I'm saying it wouldn't hurt for them to pull back the curtain and engage with people. Removing some of the board's power from the process would also be a good thing, I think. The way things stand now, a jury goes through all of the submissions to select finalists, usually 3 of them. They hand those finalists to the Pulitzer board, and a subcommittee of board members chooses a winner from those finalists. Or if they can't choose, they may either ask for another finalist or decide not to award a prize at all. Or apparently, these days, they can now also allow a tie. I cannot think of any other major prize that has a process like this. Imagine if the board overseeing the Academy Awards allowed Academy members to vote for Oscar nominees, then either took over the process completely or fully rejected the input that they got from the Academy about who should win. I imagine that part of the reason there has been so much drama between the jury and the board historically is that this setup is like an invitation for power struggles and ego trips. And you don't need that. You can get rid of that. Just let the jury pick the winner. An added benefit to this would be that there are a lot of conspiracy theories that since the jury can't pick the winner, they try to game the system by stacking the deck when they choose the finalists. That notion could go in a lot of directions. Maybe if you want a lesser-known book or a lesser-known author to win, you don't nominate anything more recognizable or flashy that the board might gravitate toward instead of the book that you want to win. If you want one of the biggest books of the year to win, pair it with two books the jury would be unlikely to choose instead, and so on and so forth. If you want an example of a case where this could have happened, I'm not saying it did, but you could believe it if you wanted to, look to 2011. The two biggest books of that year were Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad and Jonathan Franzen's Freedom. You could argue that the jury stacked the deck for Jennifer Egan by omitting Franzen completely from the list of finalists. Of course, it's possible that the jury was comprised of anti-Franzen readers. That's possible. I happen to be one of them. He is a bit of a prickly pear. There's no denying that. Look, I don't know if stacking the deck really happens, but many people believe that it does. Regardless, it makes sense that being able to name the winner would allow a jury more freedom to just name the best 3 American books of the year. No gamesmanship required. The board would still oversee the process to ensure that there haven't been any shenanigans. I suppose they could still be allowed veto power, or at least the opportunity to debate with the jury, which I will discuss more in the next section about quality. But it would give more power to the people who are actually reading the submissions, the jury. And maybe that would start getting us more interesting winners again, which naturally leads us to the discussion about quality issues with the recent Pulitzer Prize winners. One of the things I find so interesting about following the Pulitzer Prize for fiction is that looking at the winners tells you a lot about what was going on in American society at that time. Not just what was happening, but what the fears were, what was valued, and in the negative spaces, what was overlooked and why. Allow me to go on a bit of a tangent because I find this really interesting, and hopefully it won't take a lot of your time with it. In the early days of the Pulitzer, we were not far off from the Industrial Revolution and the Civil War, not to mention World War I, which was ending as the Pulitzer Prize began, and the Great Depression, which happened toward the end of this period that I'm talking about. Rigid social structures and class boundaries were coming down while jobs were moving from farms to factories. Society underwent a rapid evolution, and a lot of fiction at the time captured this sense of whiplash experienced by a generation that had grown up in a world that no longer existed. Something I think a lot of us today can relate to 100 years later when the internet has changed so much of how we live. The Age of Innocence is probably the best example of this type of literature, but a lot of winners from 1918 through 1940 capture this sense of cultural displacement between generations. World War II marks a huge shift in focus. Not only did women become far less likely to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction during this period, Ellen Glasgow won in 1942, and after that it was all men until Harper Lee won for To Kill a Mockingbird in 1961. But most of the winners deal with war or government through the end of the 1950s. The 1943 winner, Dragon's Teeth by Upton Sinclair, is even a spy thriller about fighting the Nazi menace. The Pulitzer board became very conservative in the face of World War II and later the McCarthy hearings, and it shows. Until recently, this was the least interesting period of Pulitzer winners, with a few exceptions, of course. You may have noticed that I haven't read any of the Pulitzer winners for this period yet in my Pulitzer Prize project, and this is exactly the reason. Being honest, most of them just don't look interesting. In the 1960s, things began to shift again. As the civil rights movement marched on, the Pulitzer began to turn away from rah-rah government propaganda to more considered and even critical looks at American life. To Kill a Mockingbird, The Keepers of the House, and The Confessions of Nat Turner, chief among them, capping off the decade with the first Native American to win the prize in N. Scott Momoday's Housemaid of Dawn. In the 1980s, the Pulitzer's interest in books that re-examined the American legacy deepened, going for books that sort of questioned a sense of American myth-making and what the actual truth of what it is to be American looked like. The Color Purple, Lonesome Dove, and especially Beloved, almost entirely avoiding the Reagan-era excess that defined so much of the rest of the decade. The 90s was an interesting time for the Pulitzer. You have big-name winners like John Updike and Philip Roth, but most of the awards went to quieter, lesser-known books and authors. Here, you find hidden gems like A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain, Martin Dressler, and the Mambo Kings play songs of love. You see early, perhaps career-defining recognition for Jane Smiley, Annie Proulx, and Jhumpa Lahiri. And that leads us to that remarkable run of winners in the 2000s, which is hard to define aside from the fact that you can't really argue with any of the choices. Maybe it's hard to define because we're still so close to that decade that we can't see the forest for the trees yet. Or maybe it has something to do with the fact that this time, the Pulitzer refused to react to the prevailing politics of the time. Looking at the winners, you would not know that this is the decade where 9/11 happened. The United States became mired in a war. The economy collapsed, and political divisions began to widen and become entrenched. Maybe 1990 through 2009 represents when the Pulitzer started to stand on its own, aiming to recognize literature on its own terms. And maybe the lackluster winners we've seen over the last decade represent an identity crisis. The biggest successes, the ones that are most likely to stand the test of time, are the most obvious winners. All the Light We Cannot See, The Underground Railroad, Trust, and Demon Copperhead all were among the most prominent, most critically rewarded titles of their years. The Pulitzer seems to lose its footing as soon as it strays away from that formula. It's almost as if the Pulitzer doesn't know what it should be doing anymore. I should admit, though, the Overstory was the rare exception of a recent gamble that paid off. In the years since Richard Powers won, his star has risen considerably. That win feels on par with the 90s when the jury selected something that didn't necessarily feel obvious, but worked. The 90s actually feels like a good comparison for what the Pulitzer appears to be determined to be right now, a tastemaker. Obviously, the trend varies year to year as the jury changes, but on average, the Pulitzer today doesn't seem to want to bow to public perception. There have been several years where books that were either very popular or well-liked by critics and other book prizes were passed over by the Pulitzer in what feels like a deliberate choice on behalf of the juries. In 2018, the winners of the Booker Prize, Lincoln and the Bardo, and the National Book Award for Fiction, Sing Unburied Sing, were not included among the finalists, and less ended up winning. Regardless of whether or not you like less, I think we can agree that it feels like an odd winner, especially when both Lincoln and the Bardo and Sing Unburied Sing were right there. 2022 gave us Honoré Fanon Jeffers' The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, Percival Everett's The Trees, Jonathan Franzen's Crossroads, a Franzen novel that even people who don't like Franzen novels seem to like, Maggie Shipstead's Great Circle, and Lauren Groff's Matrix. Not one of those books became a finalist. Instead, 3 largely unknown novels were selected, and we ended up with The Netanyahus. Last year, or rather this year, was more of the same. In a year that gave us The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, Northwoods, Tom Lake, Absolution, Biography of X, Blackouts, Chain Gang All-Stars, and This Other Eden, among many other contenders, we ended up with a divisive shortlist that gave us Night Watch as a winner. it just doesn't really compute. How is it possible that books that so many other people, critics, readers, other book awards, deemed to be the best of the year, failed to register with the Pulitzer? Not just this most recent year, but in several recent years. All too often, the Pulitzer seems to be rejecting the very notion of consensus favorites, choosing to tread its own path as if to say, these are the books and authors we think you should be paying attention to. The results have been very mixed and probably not great. I'm not saying that the Pulitzer needs to align with public perception. Tinkers is probably the best example of a jury pushing the boat out against the tide of publisher marketing, sales data, and critical consensus to recognize a truly worthy book. When you read Tinkers, it absolutely feels like it belongs in the Pulitzer family. But it shouldn't feel like a single wisp of attention from critics or other book prizes should automatically disqualify a book. And all too often, over the last 10 years, it feels like that's the case. And I realize it feels a little off to be having this conversation a year after two of the largest books of that year, Trust and Demon Copperhead, tied for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. But I think that year is an outlier. And in my deep dive, asking how the tie happened, I speculate that the jury for that year probably didn't play by the standard rules of engagement that juries seem to adopt these days. And that, of course, is a video that I have done, and it will be linked down below if you'd like more about that. This is a problem that's more difficult to fix because identifying the best book of the year is a subjective process. In his essay about the experience of being on a Pulitzer jury, Michael Cunningham describes that one of the most difficult things about it is the jury coming together to agree on criteria and standards. To me, this is what the board's function should be. Not deciding the winner and lording over the jury, the board should be a governing body that defines the criteria and standards the jury applies, and it should hold them accountable for following those standards. It's also tricky to say how this can be fixed because the Pulitzer is so opaque about what the process entails. I'm inclined to say that maybe there should be more dialogue between the board and the jury while the jury is selecting the finalists. But I don't know to what extent there already is dialogue between them, if at all. The jury should, of course, be allowed to meet and discuss submissions without the board, but there should probably also be discussions with the board about which titles are being eliminated from the running. That would give the board oversight to ensure standards are being followed and allow them to gently push back or ask questions about the decisions. Why is this book not being considered? Why this title over this one? Can we justify these as the best books of the year? It would create clarity, accountability, and responsibility. Maybe if we start having those conversations, we can start to remove some of the inherent genre bias inherent to major book awards. The Road is the closest we've come to a science fiction winner. It's been over a decade since a collection of linked stories won, and more than 20 years since a traditional short story collection took home the prize. I'm not suggesting that the Pulitzer should eliminate all standards, and it certainly shouldn't turn into a popularity contest. But there have been great, innovative genre novels over the last few decades that never had a chance with the Pulitzer because traditional literary thinking says genre fiction isn't serious enough. And while the Pulitzer hasn't exactly been bad at diversity, that's another area that could be improved with a focus on clarity, accountability, and responsibility. We've only had 2 Native American winners, and the last time a Black woman won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction was 1988, when Toni Morrison won for Beloved. And you can't tell me that there haven't been worthy winners in both of those categories and others in all that time. It might not fix everything, but I think these changes, which aren't really that big in the grand scheme, I guess removing the board from selecting the winner would be a pretty fundamental shift. But I do think these would inject some accountability into the proceedings. And ultimately, I think we would start getting better winners. And the Pulitzer might become a more engaging prize to follow and support for other people. To sum up, I think the Pulitzer should treat the arts categories differently from how they manage the categories for journalism. That would allow the artistic categories, like fiction, to evolve more to meet the modern landscape. I also think the Pulitzer board should stop acting like a monarch overseeing the arts prizes Instead, the board should be more of a hall monitor, providing standards and guidelines to the jury and making sure that the rules are followed. The jury should be given the power to select the winner, but with a system of checks and balances between it and the board. It should be made clear to every incoming jury that their role is not to be a tastemaker, but to reward the year's best American fiction, and to help them define what that standard is. The Pulitzer Prize should also adopt some transparency. Stop being so vague and secretive about how it all works. Allow jurors and board members to discuss their role and excitement for the winner, and engage with readers. The way it functions right now, the Pulitzer feels like a secret elitist society that would rather dictate what constitutes good literature than evolve, learn, and foster dialogue with readers. I think it bears repeating that identifying the year's best book is subjective. No book prize will be perfect every year. But when roughly 6 of the last 13 Pulitzer Prize winners have not been satisfying, not just to me, but to other Pulitzer fans and general readers, it indicates that there is a problem. The Pulitzer Prize for Fiction deserves a more consistent reputation than that. I would love to hear what you think of these suggestions, what you think of a potential problem with the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, or what you think that problem is, how to fix it, in the comment section down below. Let's not just dunk on the Pulitzer Prize, because as I said, I am a huge fan. I think it's a great prize. I think by and large, it has great winners. I have really enjoyed doing my Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, even though eventually I will start having to read some of the winners from the 1940s and 50s, which to me do look a little bit dull. And if you are someone who has read through the Pulitzer winners and have a recommendation for an easy access point, I've already read All the King's Men, which is one of the exceptions from that period. It's a great book. So let me know that in the comment section down below. Just all general Pulitzer thoughts. Keep it a little positive, please, in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.